This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. The Middle East conflict expands as Israel intensifies strikes across Lebanon and Iran. Tehran responds by targeting U.S. assets in the Gulf, including an embassy in Riyadh. China again calls for dialogue. Now, the escalating conflict spilling into the Strait of Hormuz, a vital route for a fifth of global oil. Its virtual closure forcing vessels to reroute or pause transits, sending freight costs surging. And the possibility of a prolonged Iran war and curtailed energy supplies weighing on investor sentiment. Oil extends gains and stocks dive. Now, thousands of delegates are heading to Beijing for China's key political event, the Two Sessions. But on the eve of those meetings, 3 generals are removed, days after the ousting of 9 military officials. Also, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung is in Manila for summit talks with his Philippine counterpart. On the agenda, stronger ties in defense, trade, critical minerals, and AI. Also tonight, this South Korean startup wants to take on giant NVIDIA in artificial intelligence, not in raw computing power, but rather on a front it sees as vulnerable for the world's most valuable firm. Global concerns mounting as the conflict in the Middle East extends its reach into proxies and partners. Israel intensifying its strikes on Lebanon as well as Iran, while Tehran continues to target U.S. assets in the region. Well, Israel has now moved its troops into South Lebanon, describing the move as a forward defense measure along the border. The deployment comes after new evacuation orders were issued to residents in parts of the country. Well, fresh explosions have also been reported in Gulf nations as Iran intensified attacks on U.S. targets. Qatar earlier reporting that it intercepted 2 ballistic missiles, while Iranian state media says an American air base in Bahrain is the latest to be targeted. Now, a second U.S. embassy was struck in just as many days after Riyadh reported 2 drones hitting the building in the early hours and caused a fire. The vicinity was empty and no injuries were reported. Well, the retaliatory attacks prompting the U.S. State Department to order the evacuation of non-emergency personnel and family in the region. Washington says at least half a dozen American soldiers have been killed after Tehran struck back. U.S. President Donald Trump warned that there will be a response to the attack on its embassy in Saudi Arabia. He previously said that the operation, codenamed Epic Fury, could last 4 to 5 weeks and signaled that the U.S. is prepared to extend if necessary. Mr. Trump also urged the Iranian people to take over the government after the attacks conclude. Well, the U.S. CENTCOM, meantime, reported the destruction of command and control centers of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iranian Red Crescent says more than 550 people have been killed in Iran so far. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also gave a new narrative of how the conflict started.
We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that the current crisis in the Middle East will not be what he called an endless war, but emphasized that it could take time. Well, Blake Sifton is covering these developments for CNA, and he joins us live from Dubai. So, Blake, as we've mentioned earlier, Israel is escalating its offensive against targets in Lebanon. What more can you tell us?
Good evening. Well, this is a significant development and a significant escalation. Israeli forces have pushed into Lebanon, up into south of the Litani River. They say that they are doing so to thwart threats and prevent infiltration attempts into Israeli territory. Now, how serious that threat of infiltration from Hezbollah is unclear. Of course, the Israeli military has been striking any and every Hezbollah target they can find, basically, in southern Lebanon since a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah came into effect in 2024. But they now, for the first time since that ceasefire have soldiers deep into Lebanon. And then wider strikes, of course, are happening across the country. We understand they are striking command and control, satellite infrastructure, as well as weapons depots. There's been strikes in the southern suburb of Beirut, which is a major Hezbollah stronghold. El Manar TV, which is affiliated with Hezbollah, says it has been struck as well. Now, on the Hezbollah side of things, their response has been reasonably muted, much weaker than people expected. Today, there's been around a dozen rockets fired into Israel, as well as what the military called several drones. 4 people were lightly injured in those attacks. Those are the first Israeli casualties from fire from Lebanon since that ceasefire came into effect in November 2024. So whether this limited response is a strategic decision by Hezbollah or perhaps a reflection of their weakened capabilities following all these years of war with Israel is unclear at this stage.
Well, Blake, we're also hearing more countries, they're joining the call for dialogue and ceasefire in the Middle East. But how does the path to peace look like at this point?
At this point, a resolution to this conflict appears very slim anytime soon. Of course, Iran has said they will not negotiate under fire. President Trump, as you say, has said that the conflict could go on for weeks. Iran is expanding the kind of targets they are striking. They have targeted energy infrastructure in both Qatar and in Saudi Arabia. At least initially in this conflict, in those countries in the Gulf, they were targeting U.S. military bases and assets. But now they seem to be striking critical infrastructure in those countries directly. And then, of course, we've also seen back-to-back attacks on U.S. embassies yesterday and today. Today in Riyadh, 2 drones attacked the U.S. embassy there. According to the Saudi Ministry of Defense, it caused limited fire and minor material damage to the embassy. Yesterday in Kuwait City, the capital of Kuwait, smoke was seen billowing out of the U.S. embassy compound there. And we understand that the embassy is closed until further notice. Of course, in the Strait of Hormuz, that crucial narrow waterway where so much of the world's oil supply passes, we've seen attacks on oil tankers and ships there, as Iran says that they are closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Hey, many thanks for that update, Blake Sifton for CNA from Dubai. Well, the escalating conflict in the Middle East is sending shockwaves through global energy markets. China repeating a call today for all sides to ensure shipping safety in the Strait of Hormuz, a critical artery for global oil flows, saying that it will take necessary measures to protect its energy supply.
中方敦促各方立即停止军事行动，避免紧张事态升级，维护霍尔木兹海峡的航道安全，防止对全球经济造成更大的影响。
Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi saying that Tokyo is paying close attention to LNG supplies and price trends. Japan is among the world's largest importers of energy. Ms. Takaichi's remarks follow her chief cabinet secretary's urging for Japanese vessels steer clear of the waterway.
また昨日ですが、茂木外務大臣から駐日イラン大使に対してホルムズ海峡の安全確保について直接提起をいたしました。エネルギー安全保障を含む中東地域の平和と安定は我が国にとって極めて重要であります。
South Korea, too, expressing concern for its 40 vessels sailing near the strait. Over the weekend, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards declared that the key oil transit route closed on Saturday, prompting severe shipping disruptions. Delegates across China are preparing for their most significant annual political gatherings, known as the Two Sessions. Officials of the nation's Political Advisory Committee, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC, highlighting a range of matters that will be discussed when the event opens tomorrow, Wednesday. Well, it's widely considered to be a relatively low-stake meeting as compared to the National People's Congress, which opens a day after. Well, that's the gathering of the country's top legislature. And for more, CNA senior correspondent Tan Yuguan joins us live from Beijing. So first up, Yuguan, what did the CPPCC officials say at the press conference about the gathering tomorrow?
Well, before I talk about what the spokesperson said, right, that the briefing room at the Great Hall of People today was really filled to the brim with many reporters from all over China and all over the world crowding the room for the briefing. Reporters who did not queue early were forced to stand on the sidelines throughout the briefing. The spokesperson revealed over 2,500 reporters and crew have registered for the 2 sessions. Just goes to show the sort of attention the briefing is getting both in China and beyond. In the words of one Chinese reporter from Chengdu, who was just seated next to me, and she was recording a teaser, and she said that every word dropped at the briefing has the possibility of becoming a headline. However, I must say that there wasn't much in way of unexpected headlines. However, the spokesperson did demystify the role of the CPPCC in China's policy-making apparatus, and how delegates conduct on-ground inspections, publish detailed reports with policy suggestions to allow the party leadership to make informed decisions and to formulate recommendations that's right for the country. For example, the spokesperson cited the implementation of the 5-year plan that just concluded, the 14th 5-year plan. The spokesperson revealed that the CPPCC 10 specialized committees ran sustained oversight projects, submitting over 300 suggestions for the implementation of that plan in a wide range of topics, including on improving business environment to even sports and education integration. Mr. Liu cited the example of how, because of concerns about the physical fitness of teenagers, the CPPCC submitted a proposal to address that, and that was fully incorporated into the physical fitness improvement plan for students. Otelli?
I'm also wondering, one of the topics could be about President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption purge. The CPPCC they voted to remove 3 generals from the advisory body. What more do we know about them?
Yes, of the 3 removed from their seats at the CPPCC, 2 previously held key positions in the Army's ground force. The 3 were also removed from their roles in the high-level standing committee and relevant special committees. Their removal comes as the anti-corruption drive continues within China's top military brass and within the defense industry. The authority gave no explanation for the removal, but it does follow last week's sacking of 9 military officials by the National People's Congress, or NPC. That's China's top legislature. Now, of the 3, one of the generals was the commander of the PLA ground forces right up to June 2021. Meanwhile, the other general was the first commander of the now disbanded Strategic Support Force. Now, that force was the People's Liberation Army's 1st Division to oversee the military's space, cyberspace, electromagnetic, and psychological warfare capabilities. Meanwhile, the 3rd general served as a political commissar of the army right up to January 2022. Right, so he was responsible for ensuring that the army toe the party line as well as observe party discipline. So with the expulsion of these 3 generals from the CPPCC, it's quite clear that the anti-corruption purge within China's military top ranks is far from over. Otelli?
Many thanks for that report. CNA senior correspondent Han Yu-guan speaking to us live from Beijing. Well, on that note, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, the war in Iran comes just as the global economy was beginning to recover from President Trump's tariff shock. Well, we'll speak to an expert about the possible implications of the conflict. Hello again. Good to have your company. It is now time for your business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, seems like stocks and bonds tumbling again for a second day on fears of a prolonged shock for energy prices. Can you tell us more about that?
Afraid so, Tally. Yes. Oil gas prices continue to soar, reeling from Qatar's decision to stop production after Iran targeted its energy infrastructure. Crude prices, both Brent crude and the WTI US marker, currently up in Asian trade. Brent crude is up by 5.9%. West Texas Intermediate 3.6% high, all extending gains after Iran warned that it could target ships navigating the Strait of Hormuz. Adding to the uncertainty, yesterday Saudi Arabia shut its biggest domestic oil refinery after a drone strike. Qatar's halted production of liquefied natural gas, and state-owned Qatar Energy was set to declare force majeure on LNG shipments. That knocks off about 20% of the global gas output, and the disruption rippling through global gas prices. According to energy market analytics firm Vortexa, 90% of Qatar's LNG exports pass through the Straits, and if those are disrupted, then Asia stands to be most impacted, as 80% of its supply originates from the Arabian state. Vortexa adds that China, India, Taiwan, and South Korea will be the most affected. Global oil and gas shipping rates are soaring, with supertanker costs in the Middle East hitting all-time highs. Ship owners and brokers are reportedly asking for more than $200,000 per day to charter LNG tankers in the Atlantic basin. Now, that's more than double the rates they were seeking just a day earlier. The sharp jump highlights tightening conditions in the LNG shipping market and growing pressure on energy supply routes. To discuss more on the impact of the war on Iran, Ray Faris, chief economist from Eastspring Investments, joins us live from Singapore. Ray, good to have you on the show. Which of the three paths do you think we are actually headed towards right now over the Strait of Hormuz? Is it a short-lived conflict? Is it impairment of vessels transiting, or a full blockage?
Okay, Roland. Well, let me maybe start with a little bit of history. I entered this industry back in 1991 during the first Gulf War. So this isn't kind of the first of these incidents that I've seen. There's been disruption in the Middle East almost incessantly over that entire period. History suggests that in these types of events, oil prices tend to mean revert back to close to their starting point after about 4 to 5 months. So I think worst case, we're in for a short-term shock, but it's unlikely, in my view, that this is going to persist, in part because the Iranians are just simply very heavily outgunned by the combination of the Israeli and the US military.
So on that basis alone, but what would be for you the single indicator that would tell you that we've actually crossed the line into a drawn-out war?
I think we'd have to go well over a month of military action to get to that stage, and that just seems unlikely. But I think the main thing for investors to think about is just how bad, could this shock be? If oil prices were to go to, for example, about $100 a barrel, which is the upper end of a lot of estimates that people have out there for a prolonged disruption to supplies through the Strait of Hormuz, they wouldn't be unprecedented levels. And they would be coming at a time when the global economy is fairly strong. In the United States, there's both fiscal and monetary stimulus. Behind that, this tremendous surge in AI infrastructure investment. There's a lot of a move in AI infrastructure investment throughout Asia as well. So globally, there's a very powerful CapEx cycle that's supporting the economy. And as was earlier said on this show, we're about to get the NPC. And in China, the likelihood is for some new fiscal stimulus and a government that has fiscal capacity in reserve in order to do as much as it's necessary to hit its growth targets of close to 5%. So there could be some loss in GDP growth, but this is coming at a time when, other than in the US, inflation is low and growth is fairly robust, and there's a very powerful CapEx cycle at a global level.
Ray, I want to play out that scenario of oil hitting $100 a barrel. I mean, who in Asia would be paying the most? Is it the airlines? Is it the refiners? Is it the shipping lines? Or is it the consumer? I mean, how quickly does this actually hit inflation?
It'll take at least several months, I think, to really move inflation meaningfully. It's worth noting that most countries have some oil reserves. There's some oil that's already on the water. Nobody's going to run short in the next 2 or 3 weeks. The countries that are most vulnerable from a trade perspective are those that run large net oil import balances. So India, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand all stand out. However, even with oil up close to 10, 15%, the hit to current account balances is still going to be, in general, less than about half a percentage point of GDP. It's going to be manageable. In Asia, in most countries, inflation is really pretty low. And what's crucial about that is even in places where inflation has popped higher recently, Indonesia, for example, a lot of that has to do with gold prices. If you strip gold out of the CPIs, in most countries, inflation is much lower than the headlines suggest. And I don't think central banks are going to be particularly worried about inflation driven by speculative activity in gold.
LNG is the other sleeper risk. I mean, countries like Japan, South Korea, highly dependent on the LNG from Qatar. What does this tell you about industrial margins and electricity subsidies going forward?
The main thing it says is that, from an investment perspective, one needs to manage portfolios actively, taking into consideration some of these risks and balancing portfolios accordingly. Of course, sectors such as refining, utilities, transportation, chemicals are all going to suffer if there's a prolonged increase in fundamental cost and feedstock cost. Again, I wouldn't expect that to last more than a few months, but those are the sectors most at risk. The perspective that we take is to try to manage portfolios in a way that balances out those risks by focusing actively on the range of sectors in the economy that will be either neutrally affected or have some degree of cushion. For example, electronics, tech, all of the capital goods suppliers that are feeding into that global capital, that CapEx boom.
And you mentioned earlier that China still has a lot of tools in its arsenal, but if energy costs rise and shipping insurance also spikes, how does that feed through China's export machine and regional supply chains? I mean, would this, for example, accelerate relocation, reshoring decisions across ASEAN?
I think the key thing there is to remember that this would be a global shock. Everyone would be affected. In terms of current account balances, there'd be some countries more affected than others, but at the level of the cost structure of industry, it would run right across all countries. So I don't think it would really change the relative competitive position. And certainly China is tremendously competitive even now. So I wouldn't expect it to have a really meaningful impact on the Chinese economy. At most, if we ran oil at $90 to $100 a barrel, over the course of the year, it might cut 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points off of GDP. But I would expect fiscal stimulus that would probably offset a lot of that.
Ray, appreciate the insights and analysis. That was Ray Faris, Chief Economist from East Springs Investments. And I'll be back with more business news later on in this hour. But now, back to you, Telly.
Oh, thanks for that, Roland. Well, on that note, we're going to go for another short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, satellite imagery reveals what appears to be the first known strikes on an Iranian nuclear site since the start of the war. And amid flight disruptions in the Middle East, Singapore considers repatriating its citizens in Bahrain by land to the Saudi capital. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. The war on Iran extends into proxies and partners. Israel intensifies its strikes on Lebanon and Iran, while Tehran hits more U.S. assets in the region. Well, the escalating conflict also spilling into the Strait of Hormuz, a vital route for a fifth of global oil. Crude extends gains and stocks dive as the possibility of a prolonged war and curtailed energy supplies weigh on investor sentiment. And China widens its military purge, announcing the removal of 3 more generals on the eve of its most significant annual political gatherings, known as the Two Sessions. China has again called for the resumption of talks on Iran's nuclear issue. Beijing says it respects Tehran's legitimate right to use nuclear energy peacefully, as it condemned U.S. strikes against Iran during ongoing talks, calling it a violation of international law and the basic principles of international relations. Well, the Institute for Science and International Security, a Washington-based think tank, says an Iranian nuclear site appears to have been struck, the first known attack against such facilities since the start of the U.S.-Israeli operation. Well, the think tank, pointing to commercial satellite imagery, says that access points to the underground uranium enrichment plant at Natanz, were hit sometime over the weekend. Now, that facility had previously been attacked by the U.S. last June. Iran denies that seeking atomic weapons and says that the U.S. and Israeli attacks were unprovoked, which took place as Tehran and Washington were in negotiations on a nuclear accord. And earlier we spoke with Nader Hashemi, Associate Professor of Middle East and Islamic Politics at Georgetown University. And he said that Iran's targeting of American allies in the Gulf region is strategic to pressure the U.S. to de-escalate.
You know, Donald Trump is known for, and he was expected to engage in some sort of dramatic strike on Iran, similar to what he's done before, when in 2020 he assassinated Iran's leading general, when more recently in Venezuela he staged this capture of the Venezuelan, president. Now, we were expecting a similar type of operation, but it seems like, according to what Donald Trump is saying today, that he's not interested in a short war. He's interested in something much bigger, much larger. And that does actually make sense to me. I think the goal here, as Donald Trump has said, is to really degrade and eradicate Iran's military capabilities, to weaken it as a state, to prevent it from being able to project power beyond its borders, in the hope that when this war is over, American interest and Israeli interest will reign supreme over the entire Middle East, and American allies could feel more secure in the region. I think that's very much the goal and the objective. And there's a sense, and this is in the reporting, that the time to strike was now, because Iran was at its weakest point in its 47-year post-revolutionary history, with a broken economy, its people in revolt, its allies in disarray. I think that's very much the strategic objective. And Donald Trump sort of confirmed that today in his remarks.
Right. Understood, Professor. I want to ask you about the dynamics of the region now. We know Iran has launched attacks on all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council members. It's gone beyond military bases, American military bases, into oil facilities, even some civilian infrastructure. We know the GCC, I read the GCC is furious, but has been restrained so far. So I'm wondering, is that going to last? And I wonder what it means, for Iran-Gulf relations in the future.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a deliberate strategy by Iran to force the United States indirectly to make concessions and to de-escalate. All of these countries are strong American allies. All of these countries have American military bases on them. And I think the strategy here is to pressure these countries, hoping that they will be able to pressure the Americans in a way that the Iranians, want them to be pressured. In other words, to de-escalate. So just for example, just to cite one example, the reputational selling point of the United Arab Emirates and of the city of Dubai was that it was a safe haven. It was a place of tranquility. It was a modern society, an open society. Come and invest, come and hang out, whatever your background, you could have a good time here. Now that's been damaged as a result of this war. And Iran wants to send a message to these Gulf neighbors that if they're going to host American military bases, and if they're going to secretly, behind the scenes, lobby the American government, along with the Israelis, to bomb Iran, and we know that's the case now because there's good reporting in the Washington Post that the Saudi Crown Prince has been doing precisely that, the Iranians are going to say, well, we're going to force you to pay a price, that if you want to live in this neighborhood, and if we can't survive, and if we can't have an economy, then no one can have an economy in this region. I think that's very much the strategy and the calculus. And of course, it's going to reset relations between Iran and its neighbors. Things were moving in a relatively better direction. There was détente after a period of acrimony that characterized the relations between Iran and its GCC neighbors. But after this is all said and done, there's going to be a complete sort of, I think, new drawing board that everyone will have to gather around and figure out a new way to coexist. And I think Iran is deliberately trying to send that message, to its Arab neighbors that, either we all, live together in this region in harmony, but if one of us is going to be attacked and bombed and overthrown, then everyone is going to have to pay a price. I think that's the logic in Tehran today.
Well, meantime, the Singapore embassy in Riyadh says that it's considering using buses to transport people from Bahrain into the Saudi capital to bring them out of harm's way. And this will allow Singaporeans to catch international flights that are still available back home. Now, on Facebook and email, the embassy says it's gauging demand from Singaporeans in Bahrain and called for those who are keen to register their interest through this form. It adds that the evacuation exercise has not been confirmed. This journey, if it goes ahead, is expected to take around 5 hours. MFA also emailed Singaporeans in the United Arab Emirates to highlight a possible option of returning home if they needed to leave soon. The current advice is to shelter in place. They can travel by Oman Air from Muscat to a third country and connect to a flight to Singapore. And we have more coverage of this developing story on our website, cna.asia, including this explainer on how Iran's low-cost Shahed drones are shaping the conflict in the Middle East and how the United States is responding with its own economical drone solution modeled on Iranian designs. In other news, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and China's Vice Premier He Lifeng are reportedly scheduled to hold trade talks next week in Paris, and that's despite tensions over America's strikes on Iran. Discussions between the top trade officials are said to be focused on economic issues, including Chinese purchases of Boeing planes, as well as reciprocal investments. The meeting would also be the first high-level talks since the U.S. Supreme Court struck down President Donald Trump's global tariff plan. Reports added that trade talks are being kept separate from geopolitical matters. China has been criticizing U.S. attacks on Iran, the foreign ministry calling it an indiscriminate use of force that cannot be accepted. The heightened tensions potentially complicating summit preparations between U.S. and China leaders. President Trump is due to visit at the end of the month, although Beijing has yet to confirm that. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung is arriving in the Philippines today to meet President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. for a state visit. The leaders are set to discuss bilateral ties in areas of defense, maritime and economic cooperation, while also focusing on emerging sectors such as nuclear power, shipbuilding, critical minerals, and AI. Both countries are marking 77 years of diplomatic ties this year. With the Philippines taking over the ASEAN chairmanship, talks will also likely focus on upgrading a free trade agreement between the bloc and South Korea to a comprehensive partnership. Discussions first started when the South Korean leader was in Malaysia last year for the ASEAN summit. He had then proposed an ambitious goal of $300 billion in annual trade between South Korea and the bloc. Coming up on East Asia tonight, South Korean startup Furiosa bets on efficiency instead of raw computing power to make its mark in the AI race.
Companies are competing in computing infrastructure to build AI models, but it's at huge events like this where they can showcase that technology.
The growing role of AI and its ethics high on the agenda at the annual Mobile World Congress. Hello again. As promised, Roland is back with the market action for the day. So, Roland, it's another heavy day for the equity markets?
Right. That's right, Oteli. Investors assessing the fallout of U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran and the repercussions it could have on inflation and global trade. The Middle East conflict rippling across the region, with investors assessing the impact on global energy supplies and the knock-on effect for domestic growth and inflation. Japan's Nikkei 225 closed down for the day 3%, while South Korea's Kospi benchmark finished 7.2% lower, logging its biggest percentage drop in 19 months. And that's in spite of massive gains in defense stocks. South Korea's largest defense manufacturer, Hanwha Aerospace, saw shares surge nearly 20%. Shares of air defense systems maker Lignex One, as well as Victech, makers of electronic warfare systems, closing up around 30%. Airline stocks continue to be under pressure amid higher jet fuel costs and as air travel to the Middle East remains severely disrupted by the conflict. Shares of Australia's flag carrier Qantas down almost 2%. The stock trimmed some losses after its CEO tried to reassure investors, saying that the airline is pretty good hedging in place, but warned of potential impact from spiking fuel prices. Japan Airlines down about 6.5% for the day. South Korea's leading air carrier, Korean Air, also the biggest laggard, more than 10% in the red. And if you're trying to fly Asia to Europe this week, you might get a serious sticker shock. Not because airlines suddenly raise prices, but because the market has been hit by a capacity and cost shock at the same time. I'll take a look at this live map from Flight Radar 24, which gives a time lapse of civilian air traffic from normal operations to when the US and Israel launched its military operation on Iran. Dubai alone typically handles some 1,000 flights a day. And when hubs like this go offline, well, that bridge between Asia and Europe loses a huge chunk of capacity overnight. Flights from Asia to the US, though, less affected because they don't depend on Gulf airspace. Secondly, detours are costly. With Middle East corridors closed, airlines are rerouting either north or south via Egypt or Oman, adding flying time and fuel burn. And that's landing just as oil prices spike, which can lift jet fuel costs and put pressure on airlines' margins and eventually ticket prices. Thirdly, demand is being forced onto fewer alternatives. Passengers shifting away from Gulf carriers towards non-stop services and alternate hubs. And those seats are disappearing fast. Now, Cathay Pacific's Hong Kong, London economy class seats were unavailable until March the 11th, and Thai Airways Europe-bound flights have been fully booked, according to Thailand's transport minister. As a result, dynamic pricing has kicked in compared to airfares post-COVID. Travelers right now facing a sharp spike. For example, a one-way economy flight between Hong Kong and London currently 4 times more expensive today as compared to the next available flight later this month. And if you wanted to depart from Bangkok to London today, well, it'll cost you 2.5 times more if you were to wait for a few days later. And should the Middle East conflict persist, watch out for the next lever, fuel surcharges. Japan Airlines CFO says the carrier plans to adjust its international fuel surcharge, and if higher fuel and longer routings persist, more airlines may follow. Association of Asia Pacific's Airlines Subhas Menon is also warning that the Middle East airspace shutdowns is costing airlines dearly through costly reroutes to Europe. The profit margins will shrink fast, driving up airfares, and carriers pass on fuel and time penalties to customers. A BlackRock-backed group of companies reportedly seeking to complete its acquisition of C.K. Hutchison's global ports business, excluding 2 terminals in Panama, which were seized by Panamanian authorities last month. The Financial Times reports that Swiss-Italian shipping firm Mediterranean Shipping Company and BlackRock are in talks with C.K. Hutch to buy 41 ports across the globe. The Hong Kong-listed company has been trying to sell its non-Chinese port businesses, which spans 23 countries, for around $23 billion. BlackRock, MSC, and C.K. Hutch did not issue a comment on the matter. Remember, in January, Panama ruled that concession for Hutchison's Panama Canal terminals were unconstitutional, leading authorities to take control of the assets last month. The Hutchison's Panama Ports Company has since launched an international arbitration proceeding against the Central American country. The US firm NVIDIA stands tall as leader in the AI chip market. But as demand for artificial intelligence surges, one Korean startup says the next phase of competition won't be about building bigger chips. It'll be about running AI more efficiently. CNA's Grace Shin reports.
NVIDIA sits at the center of today's AI boom, controlling an estimated 80% of the so-called accelerator market. Its GPUs dominate the training of large language models, the foundation of generative AI. But in Seoul, a 9-year-old startup called FuriosaAI is targeting what it sees as NVIDIA's most vulnerable flank. Not training, inference, the part of AI that runs every time someone uses it. And the battleground isn't raw power, it's electricity.
The more capable AI needs more data and compute, meaning that we need more, as we try to have more powerful AI, means we need more powerful semiconductor chips. The scale of AI in terms of compute, actually, the demand for running just a single model increased almost like 1 million times, meaning that the semiconductor capability also need to scale almost 1 million times, while we have a restricted power kind of supply.
The processing power, or the compute, required to perform calculations is scaling exponentially. Power isn't. Electricity is becoming the constraint. Unlike NVIDIA's GPUs, which evolved from graphics processors, Furiosa's chips are designed specifically for AI workloads from the start.
Our architecture and our technology is designed more AI native than the GPU, which was invented for gaming and rendering, actually. So we are very focused on AI workload, how all our architecture, all our compute and memory, and all our technology innovation can enable the better energy efficiency.
That focus shows up in one metric that data centers increasingly care about: performance per watt, more output for the same power. At rack scale, that difference compounds. Each rack has a fixed power limit. More efficient chips mean more AI processing within the same energy envelope. In a world of always-on AI services, that directly affects operating costs.
On the inference side, I think the new approach, like us actually, will take more shares down the road, because I think inference especially needs more efficiency.
As AI systems move from experimentation to infrastructure, cost efficiency becomes increasingly important and will be crucial to making AI affordable at scale. Gracian, CNA, Singapore.
The growing role of AI stealing the show at the 20th Annual Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. That's the industry-leading event for smartphones, connected devices, and digital talent. Ross Cullen filed this report for CNA from the conference in Barcelona.
Everywhere you look at the Mobile World Congress, 2 letters stand out: AI.
Hello. Please ask if you have questions.
And firms in the international mobile marketplace are racing to develop and deploy it. Samsung is second only to Apple in its share of the global phone market, but new devices now focus less on features like cameras and instead emphasize artificial intelligence upgrades. Alongside Samsung, other Asian firms are represented across the conference, like Huawei, China Mobile, and ZTE.
AI is reshaping our industry.
Big European brands are here too, like Finnish mobile giant Nokia, once the 5th biggest firm in the world when it led the way in handsets. Now it's a major supplier of 5G and 6G networks, and says it is aware of the ethical sensitivities surrounding AI.
Everything has to be very transparent, and when you have transparency, you can also put very clear governance in place. So it has to be crystal clear what is happening, where, what, when, how, so that there is no hidden backdoor, because it's all about being a trusted supplier to the industry, and you can only be trusted and secure if everything is transparent.
Mobile industry experts argue that every company, no matter what the sector, needs to pivot to be data-led in a world increasingly driven by AI.
Companies are competing in computing infrastructure to build AI models, but it's at huge events like this where they can showcase that technology.
AI is the buzzword in worldwide mobile infrastructure, But in such a crowded sector, digital firms need innovative ways to get their message heard. That's according to Mike Ellery from the Sparks marketing agency.
We've noticed garbage in, garbage out. So if you give it direction, you frame the question really well, you frame the ask really well, you make sure it's on point with what your mission is as a company, then sure, you can get some great results. You also have to go through those results and make sure that it aligns with where you're going and what your strategy is.
But as companies clamour to showcase next-generation tech, it's not all about amplifying innovation. Central to discussions is how AI should be inclusive, scaled safely across industries, and balanced with ethical standards, especially as it takes on more decision-making roles even here in the world of mobile connectivity. For CNA, I'm Ross Cullen in Barcelona.
And you're all caught up with the business news at this hour. We'll tell you.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Now, in other news, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has arrived in Australia, the second stop of his three-country tour. And he is expected to address Australia's parliament and meet Prime Minister Anthony Albanese as the war escalates in the Middle East. Roger Maynard has more on whether the leaders are expected to make any breakthroughs.
Mark Carney's visit will be an opportunity to further strengthen cooperation on investment, economic security, critical minerals and defence. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said, as our two countries face new challenges and opportunities, we must deepen cooperation with partners to promote national interests. Now, that's a view shared by the Canadian leader, whose office has made clear that deepening cooperation on defence and maritime security would be among the key issues up for discussion. Business and economic ties will also dominate the agenda, with Mr Carney spending his first 2 days in Sydney meeting business leaders and investors aimed at attracting new capital into Canada. Mr Carney will be the first Canadian Prime Minister to address the Australian Parliament in nearly 20 years, and what he has to say about the future role of smaller but influential countries could well set the scene for a much more emboldened and powerful force in international politics. With war in the Middle East and disruptions to the world order, the Canadian Prime Minister's visit to Australia couldn't have been better timed. But it's Mr Carney's comments at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January that underline the importance of this trip. When he said middle powers must act together, he meant countries like Australia, who are very much part of that middle power dynamic.
The middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But I'd also say that great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination.
It's this theme that is expected to be reinforced when the two leaders meet in Canberra. Given Australia's geographic position, a middle power grouping with other like-minded nations might have its appeal, though the reality is that Australia's reliance on the United States for its security will be its prime consideration, at least for the foreseeable future.
And that wraps up Tuesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.